This is episode 19 of Youthful Perspectives. I'm your host, Mason Beerbaum. My guest today is Minnesota Secretary of State, Steve Simon. Secretary Simon began his public service career in 2004 as a state representative for Hopkins and St. Louis Park, winning re-election 4 consecutive times. In 2014, he was elected as the 22nd Minnesota Secretary of State and has been serving in this role to this day. Our conversation covers topics from election integrity and civic engagement to the type of music Secretary Simon listens to on his annual 87 Minnesota County tour, and what Ben Franklin would say about the current state of America. It was an honor to sit down with the Secretary, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. And now, here is Minnesota Secretary of State, Steve Simon. I think to get things started, probably the first thing we should do is talk about what the Secretary of State does and what that role looks like on a day-to-day basis for you.
So the Office of Secretary of State has a lot of responsibilities in the Constitution and in state law, but there are 3 big ones that I'll just talk about. Mm-hmm. The biggest by head count, if you're looking at actual employees, is business services. So what that means is we take in the filings for hundreds of thousands of businesses who are either starting or renewing each and every year. I like to say we're the welcome mat for Minnesota businesses because the very first thing that someone is going to do when they start a business before they hire someone or buy inventory or get an office, you got to make the thing come alive legally. Mm-hmm. And the way you do that is by filing certain documents with our office. It's not only that kind of document, it's other things too, but it really all starts there. And we do all sorts of other commercial filings as well. So that's business services, the biggest part by headcount. Another one I want to highlight is something called the Safe at Home program. Safe at Home is an address confidentiality program, and it was originally designed for victims of domestic violence or stalking or sexual assault, but has since expanded to include more generally people who fear for their physical safety. And what it means to be in Safe at Home is it means that your true physical home address is secret. It is private for all purposes. So only our office knows and the participant knows where they live, and of course, whoever the participant chooses to tell, friends, family, etc. But we do all sorts of services for those folks, like help them vote, like get them their mail through alternate channels to make sure they have that protection around them so that those who mean to do them harm can't find them. The third area of our office that I want to highlight is the one that gets the most attention, attracts the most interest, gets the most scrutiny, and that is elections. So we oversee the Minnesota election system. We don't count votes. We never have. That all happens at the local area. That's thousands of places across Minnesota and townships and cities and counties. But we do a lot of other stuff, from certifying the elections equipment to doing post-election audits and reviews to spending a ton of time at the legislature trying to tweak and change and perfect our election laws. We give legal advice, policy advice. We oversee that system. So I like to say we're in the democracy business, and that is a big part of our work, particularly now with 8+ months to go before a big statewide election.
Absolutely. And I know when we previously talked in the basement to the Capitol, you mentioned how you have great-grandparents that emigrated from a country that didn't have the right to vote. How did that affect your views towards democracy in America?
I think it was essential to my view. I mean, so many Americans have an immigrant story of one kind or another, so it's not necessarily unique. But in my case, my great-grandparents came from Eastern Europe. They fled. They didn't just immigrate, they fled, and they fled persecution and discrimination. And among the ways in which they experienced discrimination was not only didn't they have the right to vote, but the limited right that was available was actually pulled from them 1 year before my great-grandfather emigrated. And so it's not lost on me that one of the great advantages of being an American and being in this country is the freedom to vote, the freedom to express yourself, the freedom to basically hire or fire the people who govern us. And that's never been lost on me and is, I think, a thread throughout my interest in this area.
Yeah, and that's like you said, everyone's got their own immigration background story a lot, unless you're Native American, of course. Your ancestors come from one region, usually in Minnesota, from Europe, or I guess we have a growing Somali or Hmong population. But that's interesting that your great-grandparents created that sort of impact on your view towards democracy. You mentioned how there's a state election coming up in November, the 2026 midterms as well on top of that. What have been some of the most effective ways in increasing civic engagement, and particularly, how have you found ways to increase civic engagement among young people?
Well, increasing civic engagement generally and voting in particular is a huge big deal to our office and to me personally. So just in this term of office alone, I have been now to 73 high schools and 46 colleges or university visits. So I make it a priority with my own time. It's not just about sending out emails and proclamations or anything like that. So I go there and I talk to students a lot about a lot of issues surrounding democracy and voting. And I think I have a lot of views about what moves the ball when it comes to young people in particular. But we've done a good job in Minnesota. I know that because in the 2024 election, the last big one, obviously a big presidential one, Minnesota was number one in America in youth voter turnout. Mm-hmm. Youth defined as 18 to 29. I know that's a big spread, but among 18 to 29-year-olds, we were the champs, top of the hill, number one in the country. So I know we're doing something right as a state. I have thoughts about what some of those particulars are, but we know we've got a good record, and we want to sustain that. We want young people to continue to be involved.
And I know growing up in rural Minnesota, I remember our high school had a big influence on me, at least when it comes to civic education, and then getting knowledge out there to students who are becoming eligible to vote, and knowing their rights and where their polling places are. What role do schools have when it comes to increasing civic engagement?
Big. Really big, because they can command the attention of students. And I think it's about explaining things, just the simple things. I mean, you would be shocked, or maybe you wouldn't, how those simple things can be the difference between someone voting or not voting. Like, okay, what does voting mean? Am I bringing someone? Do I have spelling involved here? The answer is no to both of those. It's just filling in an oval or a box, just like you would a standardized test, but people don't necessarily know that. So the more that schools can expose students to just that, what the heck does it mean to vote? Or little things like, okay, if I don't vote on every contest, is my ballot spoiled? Do I have to vote on anything? No. The answer is if there's 24 contests on the ballot and you vote in 11 or 20 or 23 or 2, that's okay. You can vote for those and then the rest will just be blank. Or like, where do I go for my polling place? Or, here's a big one. I grew up in Bemidji, but I'm going to school in Minneapolis. Or I grew up in Minneapolis and I'm going to school in Iowa. Can I still vote where home base is in Minnesota, or do I have to vote where I am right now? Things like that can be done in the schools, through the schools, and that makes a big difference. And then there's the other piece, which, okay, there's the legal piece. What are the rules? What are the laws? Super important, of course. But then I think particularly for young people, there's, I guess, what I'd call the cultural piece. And I say that because, we don't have mandatory voting in America. I think that's good. I wouldn't support that. But there are countries that do. Brazil, Belgium, Australia, where you've got to vote or you get fined or worse. We talked with someone a couple weeks ago or so from Brazil who said one time she didn't vote. Not only did she get fined, but her student loan paperwork was held up. So we don't have that, which means because we don't have that, the laws and rules, you got to know what those are basically, but no one can force someone to vote. There's that cultural piece that can come from the schools and other sources of, okay, the laws are in place for you to do it if you want to do it, but why should you want to do it? And having discussions in schools and through schools about, all right, what are the reasons you should want to do this thing? Because no one can force you.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's not a good thing, or it wouldn't be a good thing to force people to have mandatory voting. Of course, it's great to have high voter turnout like we have in Minnesota, but it seems almost to be un-American to force someone to do something they might not feel comfortable doing. Is there anything in particular that comes to mind when it comes to schools you think they could do a better job of when it comes to teaching civics?
I think, let me drill down even more particularly on the voting part of civics. I do have a theory about this. Here's my theory. I think that too often when we're talking about why students in particular should get involved and particularly why they should vote, too often the rules, or I'm sorry, the rationale has been kind of restricted to what I'd call the good deed reasons. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like students are told, hey, you should vote because it's the right thing to do, or you should vote because people fought and bled and died sometimes for the right to vote. And that's all true. Like we should always talk about that, and schools should too, and I think they do. What I'm saying, at least my theory, is that it shouldn't stop there. That in addition to those reasons for voting, we also need to talk about the other big thing, which is that, hey, this is in your interest to do. This is not an act of charity. It's not like a blood drive. The pitch for a blood drive for anyone who's ever given blood is, hey, out of the goodness of your heart, will you please do this kind and selfless thing that's probably going to help someone you have never met before and never will meet? That's the pitch for a blood drive, but that isn't or shouldn't alone be the pitch for voting. We're not saying, oh, please, out of the goodness of your heart, will you please vote and do this kind act for the community? There is an aspect of that to it, but my view is, look, you want to know the other reason you should vote? You should vote because this is in your self-interest. Why? Because people in communities that vote are going to get more attention. And when you get more attention, you're probably going to get more of the stuff that you want. It's not a cinch. It's not every time. It's not a layup. But man, if you're just playing the odds in life, if you vote, you're going to get more attention than you otherwise would. And if you get attention, you're going to probably get more of the stuff that you want than you otherwise would. So that's kind of the value proposition here. And back to the schools, I think schools can do an even better job than they are now by including some of that in there. It's not just a good deed, but hey, talk about why this is in your own personal interest to do.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Sticking with elections and shifting more towards election integrity, as many of you are listening and you're very well aware of, Attorney General Pam Bondi tried to demand that the Minnesota hand over its voter rolls. What were your initial reactions when you heard Attorney General Pam Bondi demand access to Minnesota's voter rolls?
Well, there are two ways to look at that. One is that she did that in a letter within hours of the killing of Alex Preddy, literally that day. And that was alarming to a lot of us because it doesn't have any apparent connection with what's going on the ground in Minnesota or what was then going on the ground. But really, the Justice Department that she leads had started asking for that data, the voting rolls, months earlier in June. And Minnesota was one of 42 states that they approached to ask for that data. And just for your listeners' sake, we're not talking about the public stuff, name, address, all that. That's public. We sell that to campaigns and political parties all the time. Anyone can get that. No, what they want is personal stuff, personal data on millions of Minnesotans, Social Security information, driver's license information, and the like. And we took a look at the law, just what the law says about that, federal law and state law, and we concluded, as most states did, that they're not entitled to obtain that information under these circumstances for a lot of reasons. So Minnesota is not just some island of defiance out there. 32 out of the 42 states, by my last count, have also said no, that their read of the law is the same as our read of the law. So this is teed up for litigation. It's in court right now. And that's where it should be, right? We got a dispute over the law. We don't fight it out in the streets. In a civilized country, we go to court and we'll do what the court system says. But we think our legal position is the better one, which is just looking at what the law says. They don't get that information under these circumstances. So that's my view on all of that.
Yeah. Is there any aspect in Minnesota history or U.S. history that relates to this sort of behavior from the Attorney General? Any historic precedent at all, or is this truly a very unprecedented event that had taken place?
Well, I'd say it's unprecedented in terms of why they want it or why they say they want it. Now, they're a little bit sort of murky and vague about the real reasons they want this and what they're going to do with it once they get it. That's the legal problem here. But I can't think of another situation where the Justice Department has asked for this stuff, with the exception of states in the Deep South in the 1950s and early to mid-1960s, where there was an allegation of wrongdoing, where the Justice Department came in there, used certain laws to get certain data. That has happened. But in terms of Minnesota, I can't recount, and nobody I know can either, a similar request for this level of really private stuff. Again, we're talking about people's personal identifying information, which in the wrong hands, of course, could be disastrous.
Yeah. And I guess sticking with this current topic here, what is your office doing to ensure that 2026 midterms and the statewide election in Minnesota are free and fair?
Yeah. Well, I always go into every election, this one's no exception, with two main goals. If I could wave a magic wand, I'm looking for two things: high turnout and low drama. That's what I want. High turnout and low drama. That's the key. High turnout, I feel pretty good. This is Minnesota. Most years we're number one in the country in voter turnout. We were number one in youth voter turnout last time as well. So I feel pretty good about that. People seem pretty excited to vote. There's a lot of motivation out there. People feel strongly one way or another about personalities and people and policies and all sorts of things going on in Minnesota and nationally. So I feel pretty good about that. But what about the low drama part? That's really where we come in. What we don't want is any sort of interference with voting, whether that's interference even indirectly from the federal government. We don't want any voter confusion. We don't want people scared away or intimidated away from voting for any reason. And so that means we got to really build a lot of partnerships around the state. We can't be everywhere. We got 87 counties. We got hundreds and hundreds of cities and townships. So we need allies and partners and teammates across the state. And we need to partner with national organizations as well, just to make sure we're thinking about best practices. And I would say this, generally speaking, when it comes to the stuff that could go wrong, let's call it that, we have sort of an all hazards approach, you might say, which is like anything in life, I suppose. You got to hope for the best, but plan for the worst. That's what we're doing. That's any job. That's being a student. That's anything, right? Hope for the best, plan for the worst. And we're doing that. And so whether it is a bomb threat or a power outage or a weather event or federal interference with the election, even indirectly, we got to game that out. We got to plan for that. We got to think up what the scenarios would be and have a ready response. No system is perfect. Ours isn't either. But we got to be thinking about that stuff, not just hoping it'll never happen. And so we're actively doing that right now just to make sure we're ready for almost whatever circumstance might arise that just might make it tough.
Yeah. And well, it's reassuring to hear that your office is being pragmatic about it. And like you said, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. That's a good rule of thumb for life and especially for elections as well, and making sure that they're free and fair. I think for some people that are listening here too, and I'm sure you run into this when you travel to the 87 counties throughout Minnesota, what do you say to folks who believe our election system isn't secure or fair? How should you go about engaging in that sort of dialogue?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of swirl out there, has been for the last several years, particularly nationally, not as much in Minnesota, about allegations of election wrongdoing, that the system is somehow rigged or somehow fixed or somehow stolen. And we know, look, I can only speak with expertise about Minnesota, and we know that in Minnesota, our elections are fundamentally fair, accurate, honest, and secure. And let me just give you one hard example so you know I'm just not talking in vague generalities. Let's take voting by mail, okay? That's one where we've heard some criticism nationally and in Minnesota. And I totally get it. I totally get how someone might say this. Steve, how is this possibly secure? You're talking about hundreds of thousands, maybe over 1 million blank ballots just out there, blank canvases. They're floating around in mail trucks. They're being stuffed into residential mailboxes. I mean, these are blank ballots. What's to prevent some guy, some mailbox thief from going into a neighborhood and plucking 1 or 10 or 100 of these out of people's mailboxes and just voting those blank ballots for themselves? How on earth could this be secure? Totally fair question. But there's an answer, and here's the answer. In Minnesota, just to use this one example, we have laws in place that almost no other state has when it comes to ballot security. Namely, when you order that ballot to come to you at home, you're not just ordering the ballot. You now have to provide your Social Security information, your driver's license number. Then when you get and vote the ballot, you've got to send it back with those same numbers attached so they know it was you. You also have to sign the ballot, and you have to find a witness who's an eligible voter in Minnesota to also sign the ballot. Okay, back to the mailbox thief. He thinks he's all smart. He's going to the mail facility and the residential mailboxes. He's plucking out 10 or 100 of these things. He thinks he's going to vote 10 or 100 times with these blank ballots. No, he won't. He can think he is. He can send him in. But unless he knows both forms of personal identifying information that the intended voter used, and he forges their signature, and he forges the witness signature, unless all of those things are true, he will not get away with his crime. Instead, what will happen is he'll fill them out, he'll send them in, and they'll never be counted. They'll be destroyed. And the voter, once they realize that their ballot hasn't come that they ordered, they're going to get a new fresh ballot. And that's probably why, in my entire time doing this job over the last few years, I have not seen one case like that. Not one. And we would see it because we get all of the prosecution information from all 87 county attorneys in Minnesota. So if there's one that's escaped my attention, then it's escaped my attention, but I haven't seen it because we've got the triple layers of security in Minnesota that make that secure. But you wouldn't know that from listening to some people talk about vote by mail as some sort of Wild West with no security. That's not the case in Minnesota. We got it. We got it buttoned up here.
It seems like it. And this reminds me of another issue that surrounds this. We're going to talk about the added security when it comes to mail-in ballots getting mailed out to people and the information that must be provided. What are your thoughts when it comes to voter ID and preventing some sort of identification in the your precinct or where you vote on election day? What are your thoughts when it comes to that?
Well, that is ripped from the headlines because as we're recording this, there's a bill before the U.S. Congress called the SAVE Act, or some people call the Save America Act, which is kind of a turbocharged version of that, which is before the U.S. Congress right now. And that one would impose, for the first time in American history, upon all Americans, it would impose a documentary proof of citizenship requirement, meaning you got to show documents. You got to show papers to show that you're a U.S. citizen. Now, let me just stand back for a second. I totally understand how anyone anywhere would first hear that idea and say, yeah, that sounds reasonable. What's the big deal? I mean, one of the major three things you need to be a voter, you need to be a citizen, you need to be 18, and you need to be a resident of the place you say you're a resident. Those are the big three. So, I mean, yeah, that's like foundational to voting. What's the big deal having to show that with paper that you are? I get that, but this is an example of the more you look, the less you like. I'll give you one concrete example. We got 69 million women in America who have a different last name now than the one they were born with, okay? So that's not a problem if you have a passport, because a passport is a document that shows that you're a U.S. citizen. But north of 20 million of those women in America do not have a passport. So what do? How does one of the 20 plus million American women with a different last name now than the one they were born with, what do? How do they prove citizenship with documents, with papers? Well, they would have to, more than likely, do it with two documents. They'd have to get a birth certificate, and they'd have to produce a marriage record. That's if they've only been married once. If they've been married twice, that would be 3 documents or 2 marriage records and the birth certificate. And this isn't just a hypothetical thing. About 15 years ago or so, the state of Kansas experimented with its own statewide version of what we would now call the SAVE Act. Same thing. You got to show your papers, proof of U.S. citizenship. And before a federal judge tossed that law out, they actually had an election under this law in Kansas. And in Kansas, when they had this proof of citizenship requirement, 26,000 eligible Kansans, eligible, just like you and me, born, raised, American citizens, all the rest, 26,000 eligible Kansans were shut out and turned away because they couldn't come up with the necessary paperwork. We're 2.5 times the size of Kansas. You can do the math. That's a ton of people who are shut out and kicked out and turned away. And you got to ask yourself, is that worth it? Because when you look at the actual incidence of voter fraud, it's not zero, but it's a very low number in Minnesota, I can speak to. It is like microscopically low. Not perfect. We want it to be zero, and it isn't zero. But it's super, super low and super, super infrequent. And so you got to balance these things. And so I totally understand the surface level appeal of some of these proposals when it comes to identification. But when you look at the real world application, you got to think through who you're shutting out, eligible people that you're shutting out. And that's why I have a lot of concerns.
And especially if you disallow that many voters to not participate in an election, especially if it's a local election like we're going to have in this November, that's a huge, I guess you could sway the election one way or another by not having that many people vote. And so I don't know, I'm of the belief that to make it as easy and secure as possible, and it seems like what we got going on in Minnesota with the current laws we have, not only is it easy to vote, it's secure to vote, and it's fair to vote. So I think I would agree with your sentiment when it comes to that issue. Turning now towards your 87 county tour, where did you come up with this idea of annually touring all 87 Minnesota counties? Was this something that you thought of when you were in the state legislature? Where'd you come up with that idea?
It was once I was in office. I got elected to this job of Secretary of State. And honestly, it didn't take me very long to figure out that the worst thing I could do, or anybody in this job could do for that matter, is just kind of sit behind a desk in St. Paul all day. I think that's isolating. I think it's bad for the office. I think it's bad for Minnesota. You got to get out there. We got a big state. We got 87 counties. We got 5.7 million people. It didn't take me long to discover the best ideas come from all over Minnesota. Literally, if I don't get out there to all corners of the state, I am cheating myself and I'm cheating the office of some really good ideas. I mean, truly, this isn't just a made-up thing. There are things that we are doing and considering and talking about here that would never have happened had I not been in a county far, far away from St. Paul. I mean, literally, I'll be in a cafe in a community meeting, or I'll be in an elections office, and an idea I would never have even thought of. But it came to me from someone, not necessarily in the Twin Cities, but a long, long way away in another part of the state. And so that got me thinking about okay, should we make this a routine thing? Not just to sort of get out there, but to get to every county in Minnesota. So we regularly do. I just started, and I'm right now on my 10th tour of all 87 counties. It's a lot of windshield time. I don't have a helicopter or a plane or anything like that. It's just me and usually one person from our office, a lot of, quick trip gas station sandwiches and, on the go kind of meetings, but it's great. I learn so much and I get great ideas from all over the state. And so it's really one of the best parts of the job is getting around Minnesota.
Well, you mentioned this, you stare through the windshield a lot when you're traveling the state. When you're in the car going from different corners of the state, is there a certain type of music you're listening to when you're in the car? You got an audiobook being played, you talking with the staff member, you catching up on some sleep when you're in the car?
I'll tell you what, the biggest thing in the car is sometimes I'll do meetings by Zoom or phone calls from the car, but not always. Sometimes I'm just staring out the window. Usually I'm with someone from the staff and we'll have the radio on and we'll flick around to local stations wherever we are, or we'll have satellite radio and just do news stuff or flick around there. No audiobooks, at least not yet. Mm-hmm. But I love a good road trip. That's it. As long as you got some good company, some good music or good entertainment or something to occupy yourself with, I love it. Nothing like an American road trip. And in Minnesota, we're a big state. I mean, physically big in terms of corner to corner. It's a long way. So, I love to buckle up and get out on the road, and I do it regularly. And again, it's just one of the best parts of the job.
What would you consider some good road trip music when you're going from different corners of the state?
Oh, man, that's hard.
Put you on the spot with that.
Yeah, that's right okay. There. Good road trip music. Oh God! It just runs the gamut. I mean, it's sort of fun, and I actually did this once to do a little bit of a Minnesota connection. So once I was on Highway 61 on the North Shore, north of Duluth, which is one of my favorite drives in Minnesota, and played Highway 61 Revisited by Bob Dylan.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep.
So that was cool. And then my other favorite drive, this isn't the music part, is the drive basically from the Twin Cities to Winona along the river. Mm-hmm. It's just great. And there's just so much cool stuff there. So music is more fill in the blank, but it's fun to do a local connection like Dylan in Northeast Minnesota.
Yeah, I've also done that too, driving on Highway 61. I think it's a tradition at this point for me to throw on some Bob Dylan, especially when you're rolling into Duluth and you're overlooking the harbor, or Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald as well. Yeah. I mean, it's the cliche song to listen to, but man, it fits the mood of that part of the state, absolutely.
Totally.
Is there a specific moment you could cite that you consider memorable when it comes to touring the state, or a specific idea where you're sitting in a local cafe with a community member and you're like, that's a good idea, and then you implemented that into your practice as Secretary of State?
Yeah, I'll give you one. This is a real world one. This is last year or the year before, I can't remember. We did a community event where we had elections people, but we had the local sheriff and law enforcement and I think I think somebody on the city council. We had kind of an array of local leaders, and we met in the back room of a cafe in Crookston, Minnesota. And one of the elections people was talking about election judge recruitment and said, hey, have you ever considered what it would take? We're a border community, and there are other border communities in Minnesota, whether it's Iowa, Wisconsin, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Could we on a limited basis, if we're facing a shortage, get people from across state lines to be election judges in Minnesota in a pinch if we really need it. And I remember saying at that meeting, I've never thought of that. What a great idea. So that's something over the last year or so we've been discussing with legislators and others about, hey, there are some strapped small communities always looking for poll workers, election judges. And could we have a situation? So that's something I never would have thought of. It didn't even occur to me until I was in that cafe in Crookston, Minnesota. That's a real world example. And so that's why getting out there is so important. And there was no press there. This wasn't a big publicity thing. There were no TV cameras. It was just a meeting that I had with a bunch of community folks in a cafe in Crookston, Minnesota. That was it. And I have a ton of other examples. That's just one that's recent that I remember that's vivid in my brain because it was an overnight trip. But there are many like that as well. And again, the best ideas come from all over Minnesota. They really, really do.
Yeah, and that can be applied to not only as your role as Secretary of State, or if you're campaigning as governor, or even if you're a city council member in Minneapolis or a state house member in greater Minnesota, going out and talking to people that are on the ground and see life a little differently than you might in the public sphere like you're in. I think that's the essence of what campaigning should be. And then not only once you're campaigning, but once you're in office as well, to not really put a pause on that sort of campaign travel schedule, but to keep on continuing to do that. Because, yeah, like you said, you're going to come up with ideas you never would have thought of if it weren't for going out and talking to regular Minnesotans like you have.
You make a really good point. I think it's important to emphasize what you just said, or maybe expand on it, which is, look, too many people, they campaign, they meet people, they talk with people, and then it just comes to a sudden halt. And I think people can tell when someone's in office who only goes out there when they want to vote, who only goes out there when they're up for election or re-election, right? And I don't think that's a healthy thing. So it feels a little bit different, of course, when you're in office versus the campaign trail, obviously. And it should feel different because when you're in office, you represent everyone. It doesn't matter if someone voted for you or not, supports you or not, likes you or not. They're still your constituents. So it has to be different, and it should be different that way. But the idea of reaching out and connecting and soliciting feedback or criticism, frankly, I always tell people, look, tell me what you're thinking, including criticism. My tender feelings won't be hurt, I promise. Just let me know that stuff. I think that's important. And I actually enjoy it, too. It's not a chore. So that's nice about it, too.
Absolutely. I just have two more questions for you as we're running a little short on time here. The first one being, what advice would you give to young people who may be interested in entering politics but are disheartened by the divisive climate surrounding politics?
Man, I have something to say about that. And I would say to your listeners, so in particular when it comes to running for office, which I realize is not the whole field. You can be in and around political stuff, public service without being the candidate. But let me just focus on that since it's something I know. If anyone in your listening audience, if there's a 1% chance they would ever run for any office, whether it's President of the United States, governor, city council, school board, whatever, any office, 1% chance, here's my advice. Please do not let anyone ever tell you that there is this one true path to getting to elected office. I think if that was ever true, it's less and less true every day, and thank God for that, in my opinion. In other words, if someone tries to tell you, you need to major in this particular subject, or go to this particular kind of school, or work at this particular kind of place, I don't think that's true. I'm not saying there are things that won't make you, wiser or more seasoned or whatever. I'm just saying that it isn't, as it maybe once was, a very narrow path. I think what you need to run for office is basically two things. Number one, you need a set of a few principles that you can enunciate, talk about, and live by. No one likes a hypocrite, so live by the things that you say are important to you. That's number one. Nobody expects you, by the way, to have an issue paper or position paper on 100 different things. You're not a robot, but they do expect you to talk about 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things that matter the most. That's number one. And number two, you just got to work hard. Campaigning is hard, particularly for local office. There's an expectation that you go where people are, literally, like door knock and seek people out. And those are the two things. And there's just a broad array of life experience that can help out. And it doesn't have to be a particular narrow band of interest. You want to major in botany? Great. Do it. You want to work at, a small business? That's great too. But it's also great if you want to major in political science or you want to intern on Capitol Hill. I'm not saying those are bad. I'm just saying that's not the one true path. Mm-hmm. There are other ways to get there. So I just think that's worth thinking about. And I do hope people in your listening audience consider running for office. It's a great experience, and being in elected office is a great privilege. And I hope people consider that, because we need good people and we need young people to replenish the ranks and bring fresh, new perspectives and ideas.
Yeah, I know when I talked with State Auditor Julie Blaha, we were talking about how wouldn't it be nice if we had other elected officials who maybe aren't lawyers or maybe come from different backgrounds, like you said, like the botany background, or maybe if you're a journalist and then you go in and run for public office, because you're going to come in just like when you talk with people throughout different parts of Minnesota, you're going to come with a different perspective. You're going to come up with maybe more unique solutions that the status quo, political science or going to law school track wouldn't have thought of. And who knows what that can generate. I always love the quote from Steve Jobs of think different. And if we can apply that to, politics and public service, I think that we'd be a better state, a better country for it. My final question for you today, as we had mentioned earlier in the podcast that we've met before, and I had asked you who one of your political heroes were, and you cited Ben Franklin. Mm-hmm. And as we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence this July 4th, what do you think Ben Franklin would say about the current state of America?
Though I think he would be concerned, I think he would be a long-term optimist about America. The machinery that he helped build for this country is pretty sturdy. And we've been through a lot as a country, yes, recently, but really throughout our history, a civil war, a Great Depression. Yes, there is divisiveness in America right now, and that concerns me, and I would imagine it would concern him as well. But, these institutions that he helped build really were meant to last. Do they sometimes feel dinged and dented a bit? Sure, I think so, but not defeated, not stopped. And so I think he'd maintain an overall and long-term sense of optimism, but I would imagine he might see some of the short and medium-term challenges as concerning. And, if anyone knew a way out, it was him. Remember, it was Ben Franklin who was one of the key authors of the Great Compromise that got the Constitution passed, namely the existence of the House and the Senate. Mm-hmm. You have a House, which is the same number per member of the House. And then you have the Senate, 2 senators per state. That was the Great Compromise. And Ben Franklin was its chief author. So he knows a thing or two about durable institutions and about each side having to give up a little something for the better of everyone. So I think he'd maintain his long-term optimism, even if we were concerned about some of our short-term challenges.
Yeah. As you look back on the 250 years, we Americans, we bend, but we don't break. And so hopefully that continues to be the case for the next 250 years moving forward. Well, Secretary Simon, thank you for the time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Youthful Perspectives. Of the issues we discussed, I appreciated Secretary Simon explaining his views on voter ID and the ways his office ensures our elections are free and fair. I also was pleased to hear the Secretary and I share an appreciation for Bob Dylan while traveling on Highway 61. But ultimately, I am very grateful as a Minnesotan to know we have a man like Secretary Simon overseeing our elections. Minnesota is the envy of the country when it comes to civic engagement, and Secretary Simon and his staff are some of the many individuals who allow this to occur. So on behalf of democracy-loving Minnesotans, I say thank you. And thank you for sticking around to the end. This is Mason Bierbaum, signing off.